What if the most dangerous thing about a nuclear facility is not what happens inside it, but the fact that the entire world has spent years learning how to reach it? And what happens when the mountain built to protect a nation's most sensitive nuclear capability suddenly stops feeling safe? For years, one place in Iran stood above almost every other target in the nuclear debate. Not because it was the largest, not because it was the oldest, but because it was buried deep inside a mountain near Qom. The facility known as Fordow was designed around a simple strategic idea. If danger comes from the sky, go deep enough underground that the sky no longer matters. That depth represented protection. For its enemies, it represented a challenge. And for military planners, it created a question that had haunted modern warfare for decades. How do you destroy something that was built specifically to survive destruction? That question would eventually lead to one of the most sophisticated conventional strike missions in recent military history. But the real story did not begin with the bomb. It began with the mountain. Fordow was publicly revealed in 2009 after Western intelligence exposed its existence. The facility's location, buried beneath mountainous terrain, immediately transformed it from another nuclear site into something strategically different. This was not simply a factory. It was a statement. Iran was building a nuclear capability in a place where conventional air power would face extraordinary difficulty reaching it. And that distinction mattered. It was about capability. It was about uranium enrichment, international inspections, sanctions, diplomacy, and the growing fear that technical capability could eventually become political choice. The 2015 nuclear agreement temporarily placed limits on Iran's nuclear activities, but after the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018, the old tension returned. Iran expanded enrichment activities. And as uranium enrichment reached levels far above what is normally required for civilian power generation, the space between capability and weapon became harder for governments to ignore. That does not mean Iran possessed a nuclear weapon. It means the strategic clock was becoming more difficult to read. And Fordow sat directly underneath that uncertainty. Look at the mountain from above. On a satellite image, there may be little to see. Entrances, earth disturbed by construction, a few structures. But underground, the picture changes completely. The more difficult it becomes to attack with ordinary weapons. Rock absorbs energy. The surface can remain intact, while critical infrastructure continues operating below. That is the advantage. But here's the contradiction. The mountain protects the facility. The facility also depends on the mountain's weaknesses. A buried complex still needs electricity. It needs ventilation. It needs access. It needs workers. It needs machinery to enter and leave. It needs systems that connect the hidden world below to the visible world above. The more protection you gain, but you may also reduce the number of places through which the entire system can function. And that changes the problem. The mountain is no longer just a shield. It becomes a system. And systems can be studied. For years, intelligence analysts have tried to understand facilities like Fordow without ever seeing the inside. They compare satellite imagery. They track construction patterns. They monitor vehicles. They study entrances. They model underground structures based on what appears above them. There are no explosions in this part of the war. No dramatic footage. Just analysts staring at images and asking the same question again and again. What is hidden beneath the surface? That patience matters. Because a deeply buried target cannot be solved in a single night. The attacker must first understand the geometry of the problem. How deep is it? Where are the critical spaces? Which entrances matter? How much rock separates the weapon from the target? And perhaps most importantly, what happens if the first strike does not work? This is where the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator enters the story. A weapon weighing roughly 30,000 pounds. Designed specifically for hardened and deeply buried targets. It is not an ordinary bomb. Its size alone creates a strategic limitation. The weapon requires a platform capable of carrying it. That means the mission depends on more than explosives. It depends on aircraft, intelligence, navigation, and political willingness to accept the consequences. The bomb is only the final link in a much longer chain. And that chain had been developing for years. The United States had spent decades improving the ability to strike hardened targets. The GBU-57 was tested, modeled, integrated into operational planning. The goal was never simply to create the largest possible explosion. It was to solve a specific military problem. How do you push destructive force through the ground and into a structure designed to survive exactly that? That is a very different question. Because bunker warfare is not about destroying everything. It is about finding the point where protection becomes vulnerability. A mountain does not need to disappear. The critical systems inside need to stop functioning. That could mean direct structural damage. It could mean blocked access. It could mean damage to systems that keep the underground complex alive. And this is where the story begins to move beyond the bomb. Because Fordow was never only a military target, it was a political symbol. To Israel, the facility represented a potential nuclear threat buried beyond the reach of ordinary airstrikes. It represented something different. I guarantee. A message that its nuclear infrastructure could survive an attack. It represented one of the most difficult military problems left unresolved by diplomacy. Everyone was looking at the same mountain, but they were seeing different futures. Then, in 2025, the long-running confrontation entered a new phase. As tensions intensified, signs appeared that Iran understood Fordow might no longer be safe. Satellite imagery showed activity around the site. Vehicles appeared near entrances. Earthen draw were reportedly moved around access points. Defensive hardening, movement of equipment, emergency measures. Possibly all three. But one thing was becoming clear. The facility was no longer simply waiting beneath the mountain. It was preparing for the possibility that the mountains might be tested. And then the aircraft came. In June 2025, the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer, striking Iranian nuclear facilities including Fordow and Isfahan. Officials, 7 B-2 stealth bombers participated. 14 GBU-57 penetrators were used against the nuclear targets, while Tomahawk cruise missiles struck other locations. But the most important detail was not the number of aircraft. It was the architecture of the mission. Precision weapons, support aircraft, intelligence, long-distance coordination. Everything had to work. Because a strike like this is not simply a question of whether a bomb can penetrate a mountain. It is a question of whether an entire military system can deliver that bomb to the right place, at the right moment, against a target that has spent years preparing to survive it. And that creates the first major contradiction. The United States possessed the weapon designed to attack Fordow. But possessing the weapon did not guarantee the outcome. The mountain still remained. The exact underground structure remained uncertain. And the most important question was still hidden beneath the rock. When the bombs finally struck, the world could see the explosions. It could see impact points. It could see disturbed earth. It could see damaged entrances. But it could not see the real battlefield. Because the real battlefield was underground. And that meant the most important part of the war had just become invisible. The question was no longer whether the United States could hit Fordow. The question was what the mountain had allowed to survive. And that is where the story changes. Because everyone had been watching the bombs. Almost nobody could see what happened after them. Everyone thought this battle was about bombs versus bunkers. But the real battle was about something much harder to destroy. After the strike, the world immediately began searching for a simple answer. Was Fordow destroyed? Was Iran's nuclear program destroyed? Had the mountain survived? Had the mission succeeded? But underground warfare does not produce easy answers. Above ground, battle damage can be photographed. Buildings collapse. Vehicles disappear. But underground, the most important evidence is hidden behind meters of rock and reinforced concrete. And that creates a unique problem. The more protected the target is, the harder it becomes to prove exactly what happened to it. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan had been struck, but the full extent of the damage inside Fordow could not immediately be established with certainty. And, suddenly, the military operation became something else. A battle over interpretation. U.S. officials described the strikes as highly successful. President Trump used extremely strong language to describe the result. Other assessments were more cautious. Some analysts suggested the strikes could have caused major damage while still leaving parts of Iran's broader nuclear capability intact. And that distinction is critical, because a nuclear program is not a single building. It is a network. Centrifuges, enrichment facilities, stockpiles, engineers, technical knowledge, conversion capabilities, storage, and the political decision to continue. Destroying one node can be devastating, but it does not automatically erase the entire system. That is the first major strategic lesson. A military strike can be tactically successful without being strategically final. And this is where the mountain begins to reveal its deeper meaning. Fordow was designed to create sanctuary. The idea was simple. If the facility could survive attack, then Iran would retain options. But once a deeply buried facility is successfully attacked, even partially, the mountain no longer represents absolute safety. And time is not the same thing as immunity. That distinction could shape Iran's next move. If fixed underground facilities are vulnerable, Tehran may have incentives to disperse capabilities, reduce visibility, create redundancy, build smaller sites. The paradox is brutal. The better an attacker becomes at destroying hidden facilities, the stronger the incentive becomes to hide facilities differently. Tactical success creates strategic adaptation, and adaptation creates the next battlefield. This is why the story cannot end at the crater. The real question is what happens to the system after the strike. Consider the enriched uranium. The II had previously reported a large stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%. After the strikes, one of the most important questions became, where was that material? Could inspectors verify it? Had some of it been moved? Was it still accessible? The physical damage to a facility and the status of nuclear material are two different problems. And if one remains uncertain, this is the invisible battlefield. Not the bunker, not the bomb. The uncertainty surrounding what survives. That uncertainty affects everything. Military planners must consider future targets. Diplomats must consider future negotiations. Inspectors must determine what can still be verified. Markets must consider the possibility of renewed conflict. And governments across the region must decide whether the balance of risk has changed. This is where military power meets economics. The Middle East is connected to global energy markets. Any major escalation involving Iran can affect shipping routes, oil prices, insurance costs, and the calculations of governments thousands of miles away. A bomb falls on a mountain in Iran. 8 anchor moves through the Gulf. A government in Europe considers energy security. A military commander reviews regional force protection. One event, multiple battlefields. And this is why the meaning of Fordow extends far beyond nuclear infrastructure. The attack demonstrated that the United States could assemble a specialized force capable of reaching a target once considered extraordinarily difficult to attack. But it also demonstrated something else. No military operation produces perfect knowledge. The United States could penetrate the mountain. It could not instantly see everything inside it. That is the paradox. Technology increases reach, but uncertainty remains. And uncertainty is exactly what modern warfare tries hardest to control. The missile is not always the weapon. Sometimes the uncertainty created by the missile is the weapon. If Iran no longer knows which facilities can remain hidden, its strategic calculations change. If Israel believes buried infrastructure is no longer untouchable, its calculations change. If other countries believe deep underground facilities can eventually be reached, their calculations change. The physical strike may happen once. The psychological effect can last for years. This is the broader lesson of Fordow. The battlefield is no longer only about destroying targets. It is about changing the decisions made by everyone watching. That is why the strike may matter even if the nuclear program was not permanently erased. The mountain's symbolic power was damaged. Depth appeared to offer a form of strategic sanctuary. After the attack, depth looked more like one layer of a much larger defense system. And every defense system has a weakness. The question is whether the weakness can be found before the defender adapts. That is the cycle of modern warfare. Armor creates anti-armor weapons. Air defenses create stealth. Stealth creates better sensors. Bunkers create penetrators. Penetrators create deeper bunkers. Every solution creates the next problem. And now the world has to consider what comes after Fordow. Will future nuclear facilities be smaller, more dispersed, more mobile, more secret? Will states rely more heavily on underground infrastructure? Or will the uncertainty created by the strike push governments back toward diplomacy and verification? There is no guaranteed answer, but there is a dangerous possibility. If a state concludes that conventional defenses cannot protect its strategic infrastructure, it may decide that only stronger deterrence can. And in nuclear politics, that can create a very different future. This is why the strike raises questions far beyond Iran. For military planners everywhere, the lesson is uncomfortable. A fortress does not eliminate vulnerability. It changes where vulnerability lies. The entrances become important. The power supply becomes important. The ventilation system becomes important. The logistics network becomes important. The people who operate the facility become important. The intelligence picture becomes important. The mountain is only one part of the defense. And once an attacker understands the entire system, the fortress may no longer be a fortress in the same way. That does not make underground facilities useless. Depth still matters. Hardening still matters. Concealment still matters. But protection is never absolute. And that may be the most important strategic lesson of Fordow. The United States did not simply demonstrate the power of a 30,000-pound bomb. Years of intelligence, years of engineering, years of weapons development, years of studying the problem. The bomb was the visible moment. The real weapon was the preparation behind it. And yet, even after all that preparation, uncertainty survived. That is what makes this story so important. A military operation can be brilliantly executed and still fail to produce a final political solution. A bunker can be expertly designed and still fail to provide permanent safety. A mountain can delay an attack without preventing one forever. And a single night can prove a military concept while simultaneously creating a new strategic problem. The question is no longer whether a mountain can protect a nuclear facility. The real question is what happens when every side begins adapting to the lesson that mountains are no longer enough. Because if Iran responds by dispersing its capabilities, the battlefield becomes harder to find. If it moves deeper underground, the engineering challenge becomes greater. If it becomes more secretive, verification becomes harder. And if diplomacy collapses completely, military pressure may become more frequent. That is the paradox. A strike can reduce one immediate threat while creating incentives for the next threat to become harder to detect. So where does this leave the world? Not with certainty. The strike appears to have demonstrated real military reach. It appears to have changed the strategic meaning of Fordow. But it did not erase every question. And those unanswered questions may matter more than the explosions themselves. How much capability survived? How much time was gained? What happened to the nuclear material? What will Iran do next? And will future states learn from Fordow by building stronger defenses or by abandoning fixed facilities altogether? That is the deeper battlefield. Not the mountain. Not the bomb. The adaptation that comes afterward. The question is no longer, who has the biggest weapon? The real question is, who can adapt fastest when every advantage creates a new vulnerability? And perhaps the most important question for the future is this. Do you believe the next generation of wars will be decided by the power to destroy hidden targets or by the ability to keep your own capabilities hidden long enough to survive?